Recording in progress.
Good evening and welcome to the Tompkins County virtual meeting. Thank you for joining us and we will get started. My name is Susan Cohen and I will serve as facilitator for tonight's meeting. With me are Scott Doyle of Tompkins County, Cynthia Bianco, Erik Genga, and Lisa Danner of Tetra Tech. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, during the presentation, please, we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function. There's, as you can see in the graphic, there's a button down at the bottom of your screen. Please click that throughout our discussion and we will pick up questions at the end. Yes, at the end of the presentation. You can go to the next slide. If for any reason you get disconnected or the meeting seems to end abruptly, be patient and rejoin using the same Zoom link that you were provided in registration. So essentially log in again. And we will be recording this presentation and it will be available on the website for you to check back later. Comments and questions will also be included in the meeting summary that will be added to the website, and the link is at the bottom of your screen and you can see what the website looks like. Now here's our agenda for this evening. First, Scott and the project team will share an overview of the plan. Then we'll go over next steps and then we will respond to your questions. So now it's my honor to introduce Scott Doyle of Tompkins County. Scott.
Thanks, Susan. I appreciate it. Happy to have you all here tonight and happy to talk to you about this project that we've been working really hard at advancing here the last several years. Several years ago, this began as a part of our hazard mitigation work. Both Tompkins County and all the communities in the county identified some concerns in the face of our climate changing abruptly and having impact on our various hazards. In particular, how we would recover long-term from disruptions to those hazards. So we fortunately had the opportunity to obtain some funding from the New York State Department of State to do just this, resiliency planning and recovery planning. We're one of 5 different counties throughout New York State who's doing these updates and addressing these plans right now. Really appreciative for the Department of State for doing that, helping us fund that and supporting us through that process. And this allowed us to hire Tetra Tech to help us develop several components we'll talk about with you here tonight. So we go ahead and advance to the next piece. So this is a little bit more overview. I'll just pause to give you a little bit more detail to see, give you a sense of why we're doing this, and all the way through next step, just building on a little bit more detail of the key things we'll discuss. Go ahead to the next, please. So this is the mission statement for all the work we've taken on with the Resiliency and Recovery Plan. And it's pretty simple. It's building off kind of my initial comments on why we're doing this. But we're really looking to increase capacity for all of us in the county. It could be individuals, local governments, businesses, all of those that are likely to face disruptions associated with hazard events, in particular the chronic stresses related to a changing climate, but also the acute shocks of things that our community's certainly gone through in the past, like significant flood events. So that's the whole intent, is to help us in that recovery stage, kind of after the sirens have left, to think about how we rebuild ourselves in the right way and get ourselves back up and running in the most efficient and mindful way possible. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I really appreciate you all taking on in advance of this meeting was some of the survey questions. These survey questions help us to kind of fine tune some of the resources that we developed and understand kind of where we're going with these pieces. We kind of affirm kind of what we've captured so far. In this question that we kick things off, kind of what major disaster events have you, the folks on this call in this meeting, have you experienced? the number one of survey attendance was flooding. That's no surprise. And that's something that myself at the County Department of Planning and Sustainability, I receive a lot of calls related to people impacted with flooding. I'm not surprised at that. Severe winter storm, we've all taken that one on pretty strongly. And I think that's a badge of honor in a lot of ways, but that has really impacts to how we operate, certainly, and function through. I think we take pride in that, but it's a concern. Also severe storm. We certainly experienced a little of that earlier in the week. A lot of people experienced some disruptions associated with that. That's one that's pretty intimidating as well, that I think people have lived through, and I think we have some real concerns about. So it's not a surprise to see this, but I really appreciate people flagging these as the initial question. So I'm going to transition things over to Cynthia from Tetra Tech, and she's going to give you a little bit more sense of this project and some of the key components. I'll talk with you more about others in a moment. Cynthia?
Thanks, Scott. So as Scott mentioned, this is a really interesting project that has been funded by the Department of State, but is integrated with many other planning processes that have been taken place and that are concurrently happening to create a really unique plan, a plan that will help the residents, businesses, and citizens and vulnerable populations understand where there are resources to help them recover from a disaster, how they can make yesterday's disaster tomorrow's inconvenience. So to start out, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the phases of emergency management and to understand the context of resiliency in connection with these phases. The emergency management cycle consists of mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. It's an unending cycle, and if not addressed, it becomes a very expensive and disruptive situation. Normally, we have separate agencies, departments, and committees that look at each part of the emergency management cycle. However, this process has been created to really provide the glue or the mortar between these parts of the emergency management cycle to really provide some usable resources. So under the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, communities are able to implement FEMA guidance to proactively reduce the effects of natural disasters. By developing comprehensive emergency management plan in conjunction with updated hazard mitigation plan, governments will have the information to develop policies and procedures to support emergency recovery. So during this presentation, we'll show the connections between the planning mechanisms through the lens of economic recovery and touch upon such subjects as the relationship between business interruption and the magnitude of business closures. Understanding the relationship of the damages and impacts to disaster events is important to planting the seeds of resilience. Next. So as you can see from this slide, the Tompkins County Resiliency and Recovery Plan is comprised of components to collectively reduce the duration and severity of physical and economic impacts of disasters. We've created this graphic to show you that although we are creating separate plans, there is an iterative process in which they are connected. So the traditional plans of hazard mitigation, debris management, and economic recovery now are going to be informed by each other to provide resources for the county. So under the hazard mitigation process, which we'll explain in a little bit, we normally look and identify the hazards of concern and understand the vulnerability risk to come up with a list of mitigation strategies to reduce potential disasters, potential impacts and damages from natural hazards. In this plan, to reinforce that, we were able to create and analyze some other components to provide more detailed information. Those comprise the critical asset inventory, the water supply drought assessment, and our community rating system analysis. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. In terms of the economic recovery plan, we've provided some information on continuity of operations training, developing a recovery ordinance, and really looking at how to improve your emergency management plan recovery annex. So in brief, I will review the components of the plan to illustrate the relationship of these processes to understand the shortcomings and gaps in the procedures and to improve management, administration, and enforcement of your plans. Next, please. So as Scott mentioned, this has been a project that has been in the works for a while. Starting in 2020, we initiated the update of your 2014 hazard mitigation plan. Despite COVID, that plan was finished in December of 2020 with the approval pending adoption from FEMA and the adoption of the plan by all the communities. This plan now continues the eligibility for all the communities to access FEMA pre-disaster mitigation funds. Very important at this point in time, as billions of dollars are available through FEMA, and it is important for your communities to leverage that funding to implement your projects. During this time frame, we also developed a debris management plan starting in March. We're finishing that up now. We'll be happy to tell you about those components to help the county manage the results of storms and floods. We've done a we did a deeper dive into a drought infrastructure to understand how we can improve the resources and water supply. And we're culminating now with our economic recovery plan, which will include our continuity training and some information about how communities can improve their administration and policies for flood plain management. So this multifaceted project was initiated 2 years ago. We look to wrap it up in a few months by July, and we look forward to your input in terms of the content and the value of our planning. Next slide, please. So to give us some context, we wanted to hear what you had to say about disaster impacts and what impacts have you experienced. Not surprisingly, the top responses are power outages and road closures resulting in the inability to go to work or school. This is in line with the number of surveys that we deployed throughout the initial stages of the process. And you can see the concern is related to connectivity, accessibility, and utilities. How do these factor into the length of recovery? How can we make this an inconvenience? Next slide, please. All right, to answer that question, we'd like to review each component of the project in more detail. To summarize, here's a full list of our plan components, which consists of planning documents, but importantly, are resources that we've developed to provide ongoing guidance for communities. These will collectively help reduce the impacts of events on the economy and assist in recovery. In the next slides, we'll provide more detail on each component and explain how they relate and integrate, how these components translate into a toolkit of resources to assist government, residents, and businesses so they can be confident that they can move forward, adapt, recover, and grow. Next slide. Okay, our first component is the hazard mitigation plan. As I mentioned before, this is a plan that represents a living document to form a strategy to reduce damages to lives, property, and the economy from future natural disasters. This plan was created by a committee comprised of county agencies, local stakeholders, and regional stakeholders. And it provides a firm foundation for projects which can be implemented to reduce the vulnerability to natural disasters. For instance, example mitigation projects include home acquisitions or elevations to remove structures from high-risk areas, upgrades to critical facilities to reduce damages from flooding, infrastructure improvements, road and stream management. Ultimately, these actions reduce the vulnerability to support communities' ability to recover quickly from disasters. The benefits of mitigation planning are shown in the dollars saved and the reduction of post-disaster money spent. Next slide. All right, this slide shows the 8 hazards of concern that were identified during the hazard mitigation planning process. As you can see, they overlap with the disasters that were indicated by the surveys. We have flood, drought, and severe winter storm, in addition to the other hazards. The hazard mitigation plan development was led by the Tompkins County Department of Planning and Sustainability, and input from departments such as emergency services, stakeholders, and with significant input from the public. So based on review of our hazard history of the county and emergency management planning, these hazards were identified. The hazards of flood and winter storm have been identified in addition through the county emergency preparedness assessment as high and medium ranked hazards. So again, it tracks well with the concerns of the county. Profiles include a hazard description, but most importantly, provide an estimate of the vulnerability of the people, buildings, and structure in the county. So when you look at the hazard mitigation plan, you can understand where the magnitude of risks are and how it connects to your mitigation projects. Next slide, please. All right, so just a quick summary. There are 129 mitigation projects in the plan. They're distributed across the county-wide projects, as well as projects for each municipality. These projects cover concerns such as utility interruption, installation of generators at critical facility, water supply, emergency services, and so forth. So the combination of these mitigation actions will help improve the resiliency of the county. Next slide. All right. So as you saw, drought is a hazard of concern. And at this point, I'll ask Scott to talk a little bit about our water supply drought assessment and its outcomes. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, I'm great summary on the hazard mitigation plan too. I'm really proud of all the communities that in Tompkins County that worked on that together. We worked on that all together, and every community in Tompkins County adopted that plan and are eligible for funding. I'm looking forward to advancing that work with all the communities as well. So yeah, even though I share your concern in the survey that flooding is at top of mind for my greatest concern of hazards, we don't need to think too much in our past to think about drought concerns. Those of you that lived in the community back in 2016, we had a pretty pressing time in terms of drought and concerns about how our water systems were going to connect or help support us through that drought situation. So that was one of the issues we want to look at a little bit closer in terms of how the redundancies of our county-wide water systems and how our large water purveyors work together and maybe how they don't, to think through opportunities for improving how we work together. So we took a look from the outside from Tetra Tech's team to recommend actions for help build resiliency in our systems. So go ahead to the next slide, please. So these are a couple of recommendations that came out of that planning effort that I'm pretty excited about too. One of the things that was recommended that we should establish a regional water purveyor consortium between the major water purveyors being City, Cornell, and Bolton Point, but also involve the county environmental health and planning. I'm happy to report that this has not only been well received, but it's actually happening. We actually even met earlier today. This is a group that we've come to a better understanding of concerns between different entities, but are actively working on key things to help build that resilience, including the second bullet, create interagency agreements. Based on that meeting today, I'm feeling pretty confident that we're going to have something move through and be formalized in the next several months here to help formalize how we work together to support each other in terms of the different systems for flooding, but also the reality of harmful algal blooms as a threat to water systems. Other things that we looked at as a part of this were identifying particular funding mechanisms to help us invest in those necessary infrastructures to better connect those systems. But also thinking about on this next bullet, thinking about those that do not rely on those public water supplies, but rather some groundwater. So thinking through how we can actively monitor better well water resources and others, think through how we can advance drought information. And the last point too is kind of an obvious one, but one that came up that we need to be better at, and that's how can we really think together to implement water conservation formal programs between the different purveyors, but also the different jurisdictions. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks, Scott.
All right, yeah, right back to Cynthia. Thanks, Cynthia.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we were able to provide some additional products to improve the information that we developed in the hazard mitigation plan. And one of this is the inventory of critical assets in the floodplain. As Scott said, flood is a concern in the county, and certainly protecting your critical assets in the floodplain is of utmost importance. During the hazard mitigation plan, we did work with the committee to identify the critical assets in the county. We were able to do an exposure analysis, and we also did a vulnerability assessment to really understand which of those facilities are vulnerable to flooding and which ones really should be mitigated. So as part of this plan, the county was able to get funding to enable us to create an interactive map of these facilities to really provide more information to those facility owners, some which might be municipalities or county owned, but others which could be privately owned. As you can see in this list of assets, which is a subset of the assets that were selected, and this subset again are just the facilities that are located in the floodplain in Tompkins County. We have a wide range of facilities. So, everything from the Department of Public Works, which has to be operating and accessible during hazard events, to repair infrastructure, to medical offices, which have to be in continuous operation to, of course, help citizens and residents and to address life safety. So this is an opportunity to provide more information. Normally when we do a plan, we identify what facilities are vulnerable, but this plan has gone one step further to allow the owners to be proactive, understand what their risks are, and do something about it. Next slide, please. Okay. So as part of the interactive map, when we click on each facility, we'll be able to see the information as to what types of actions or projects could be implemented to reduce the effect of the hazard that is impacting that. So this is an example to show, what would be suggested for a utility that is in a floodplain. It shows elevation of utilities and door dams to help protect the components from flooding, and it provides information and resources of where to get information. So in this way, the county is providing an ongoing toolkit to enable, again, facility owners to take the first step in protecting the facility and to ensure continuous operation. Next slide, please. Okay. Our next component is the debris management plan, something which most likely citizens don't give a second thought to, but it's something which is very, very important. The purpose is to create a plan to manage debris throughout the county following a natural hazard event. While you may not have experienced a major event, you can imagine that if there were a major windstorm with downed trees, it would be almost impossible to navigate through the county. If there is a major flood on Route 13, any kind of traffic going, to and from or through the city would be stopped, and what would happen then? So it's very important to understand how to clean up after the disaster and to ensure conductivity to medical, business, and other facilities. So this debris management plan is a key component to receive FEMA reimbursement. Very important, debris costs can run up very quickly. So if anyone recalls pictures from Hurricane Katrina or Sandy, you will see that after a flood or a windstorm, you see mountains of debris outside of people's houses, not only woody debris and vegetation or trees, but the contents of a house is outside on the roadway, and that creates a health situation and also a situation in terms of mobility. So we're focusing with this plan not only on managing large quantities of debris, but this plan is scalable. So the process described in it can also be used for smaller scale incidents. It describes actions the county and municipalities can take during normal time to prepare for debris generating events. It provides estimates and types of debris that could be generated from a disaster. And it provides practices that the county and municipalities could implement from the pre-impact phase, the sunny day phase, through the response and recovery phases. So debris management can be labor intensive and complicated. It's especially true when you're meeting FEMA's eligibility requirements for being reimbursed for activities. So having this plan is the first step to ensuring that the county and municipalities are prepared, and that in addition, they can importantly be reimbursed for any of their eligible costs. Next slide, please. All right, so I mentioned, I mentioned a large debris generating event. So in the case of Tompkins County, we're looking at a 1% annual chance flood event, or in hazard mitigation terms, a low probability, high consequence debris generating incident that could significantly impact the county and several municipalities. So using that as context, these are our recommendations. So they're logical, starting with, it's very important to formalize roles in the debris management, understanding that the Department of Emergency Management will take a lead. It's really important to understand who will be running the operations and who will be doing the overall debris management, conduct further planning, increase the management capacity, and to procure the debris management contractors. So if the roles are not formalized, conversation should be instigated to formalize those roles. Secondly, we recommend to review and prepare debris management contracts. Generally, on a large event, the required equipment and resources and even knowledge of doing large scale debris is beyond the capability of the county or the municipalities. So starting now to prepare on-call contracts to be activated is a good practice. Next, establishing a debris management reserve fund. I mentioned that a FEMA approved debris management plan can make the county or municipalities eligible for reimbursement of costs, but the key word there is reimbursement. So we suggest that the county create a debris reserve fund to enable readily available money to initiate the debris activities, but then could be reimbursed later on by FEMA once you go through the paperwork. And finally, it's important to really further analyze your temporary debris management sites. So the debris management plan has identified some initial sites through conversation with the county and stakeholders during the planning process. However, that's just the first step. Each site must be subject to an environmental review and must really be reviewed for logistics and space to be able to perform all the debris management activities. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So it's funny, I saw a question that was posed about, is there a way to avoid development in floodplain. So that brings us to this next component of the plan, where we reviewed FEMA's community rating system and did a pilot review for one of the communities in Tompkins County to see if it is beneficial for them to participate in the community rating system for CRS. Part of the community rating system is to improve your floodplain management. And one of the first rules is don't develop in the floodplain. So yes, this plan is looking at ways to incentivize good floodplain management practices. As part of this community rating system review, we have developed, we reviewed the capability of one town, that was the town of Lansing, who decided to offer themselves as the pilot community. And in doing so, we got a lot of insight into, what could work in Tompkins County, understanding that there is a range of community capabilities in the county. And using the town of Lansing and reviewing their floodplain management activities, their resources, their codes, their ordinances, we're able to understand, what are the main activities that they can do to really start reducing your risk in the floodplains. So as part of this review, we did prepare a tool to help assess the potential impacts, and an ongoing tool and resource of best management practices for other communities that are looking to reduce their risk in the floodplain. Next slide, please. Okay. So just a little snapshot of the results for the town of Lansing. It's indicating that, there is a modest decrease in flood insurance premiums should they participate in the community rating system. To clarify, the community rating system is an incentive program whereby communities, by demonstrating that they are administrating their floodplain to higher standards, they can obtain from 5 to 45% discount for NFIP insured properties. That's properties that are insured through the National Flood Insurance Program. So understanding that the town has 34 policies with an average premium of about $1,000, we are looking at a modest discount for the insured's insurance premiums of about, $60 to $100 per year per policyholder. Again, that is something which is a moving target, since this is based on your flood risk and also the ever-changing regulations of the community rating system. We didn't mention that the county of that Tompkins County is in the process of getting new flood maps. So these calculations may be modified by the new, I guess, risk that's being indicated by the flood maps. But in any case, there's a benefit to joining the CRS. The main benefit is that the community becomes more resilient because they are enforcing policy within the floodplain to reduce development, which would reduce damages in that floodplain. However, should a community choose not to join the CRS, we do have a few recommendations. Next slide, please. Okay. So, as an outcome of our review of the town of Lansing, we were requested to provide a general resource to really guide communities who are interested in, again, reducing their flood risk, reducing flood damages, but really may not have the staff or the time to embark on full participation in the community rating system. So here, this slide shows our top 10 recommendations. Many are common sense, but you'll see right here, avoid development in the floodplain is clearly stated, which is, one of the I guess, most obvious things if you want to reduce your damages in the floodplain. However, the community rating system incentivizes a lot of other policy and planning mechanisms. Including enforcement and reevaluation of your ordinances, looking at how you can require higher construction standards, and so forth. I'd be happy to give you more information during the question and answer period. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, Susan, perhaps you can go through a few of our other survey questions.
Thank you, Cynthia. You've heard from Scott and Cynthia that the county has done a lot of planning to make sure the community is prepared for disasters. And we asked all of you the same question. What is your biggest concern related to thriving after a disaster event? And here are the top 3 findings. Number 1 is loss of electricity. Number 2 is loss of water and other utilities. And number 3 is interruptions in communications. Next slide, please. Now, programs and projects and support that you need is essential for a more resilient community and to help everyone get back on their feet as soon as possible after a disaster. So we asked the community what you'd like to see, what types of programs and supports and so forth do you think would be helpful to increase post-disaster resilience? And here are the findings. Underground power lines, community education, like we're involved with here, timely real-time information, and connecting residents with community organizations. And now I'll turn things over to Lisa Danner, who will describe how these types of recovery actions will be put into place. Lisa?
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, in recovery, most people think recovery starts later on after an event, after a disaster, or something has impacted the community. But recovery really starts when response starts as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the recovery continuum and that transitioning from response, putting out the fire, stabilizing the community, making sure the incident, saving lives, protecting property and lives, the environment, as well as, starting the recovery for the community. So response and recovery really work hand in hand. And when we talk about recovery, they can fall into short-term recovery, intermediate, and long-term. So when we talk about short-term recovery, we may talk about, days. So the response has occurred, the incident has impacted. So we've got to address, okay, how are we going to shelter people? I know one of the things that has been mentioned is, the loss of electricity is of concern. So when electricity is lost, sheltering and providing the basics for the community is very important. The debris management piece that Cynthia talked about, that's, can be the short term, some of the activities. And then starting to move into the intermediate phase of it, which could be weeks and months, all the way up to long term, which can be months and even into years. So when we're talking about recovery, we want to make sure that, we want to get the community and the communities back up and working towards, that desired end state. And how can we, revitalize and get the economic recovery back into the community and get the community back standing on its own, and back, getting the power put back on. Getting, after the floodwaters go down, getting people back in their homes, getting them out of the shelters, or getting them into some type of temporary housing, in the weeks and months, and then all the way up to, it may even result in permanent housing down the road, just depending on what the magnitude of the impact is. So the recovery process is a sequence of activities that move the community toward a recovery. to get them standing back on as quickly and as soon as possible after an event has occurred. Decisions and priorities that can be established before a disaster in the preparedness phase and response phase can help impact and assist in getting the community back up quickly and comprehensively so that they can recover and be stronger and better and more resilient in the post-recovery or in the recovery portion of the event. Next slide. So some of the recommendations for the recovery continued. So transitioning from that, you want to smooth the transition as possible going from response to recovery, and a lot of activities and things have taken place throughout this planning process. One of them is updating the comprehensive emergency management plan, updating the recovery annex, looking at roles, responsibilities, timeframes, looking at incorporating the mitigation into reconstruction activities. When they develop the mitigation plan, that's some of the things they look at. Okay, how can we mitigate or help to alleviate the impact from a disaster? So making that transition as smooth as possible is important. And all of these plans, whether it be the recovery plan, the comprehensive emergency management plan, a recovery annex, the debris management plan, all of these plans need to work in concert with each other. So they need to complement each other and make sure that they're all speaking the same language and they're not contradicting each other. So that, one plan says, well, the Department of Transportation does this, and another plan, it says it does that. So, identifying those staff roles and timeframes as well, and making sure everything complements each other in the process is really important. And the transition from response to recovery is a gradual process. Like I said, it can be from days to weeks to months to years, and making sure these plans work together in one cohesive thought. And, at the end of the day, you want to get the communities back up and running and reaching their recovery end state and to be more resilient when an event does occur, whether it be flooding, the severe storms, whatever the case may be. You want the communities to be resilient and to reach their recovery end state as soon as possible, and to be whole moving forward. And now I will, building upon that, another component to this is the community economic recovery plan component, and I will turn it over to Erik to speak about that.
Thank you, Lisa. So part of this involved a look at the community economic recovery plan. And what we did is we had put together kind of a preliminary concept and a economic recovery framework. As part of this overall endeavor, there was kind of two major components to it. The first was a review of the recovery annex. There was a fairly critical analysis of that, went through and tried to identify any gaps that existed within the recovery annex and note those items, especially as they may be accounted for in the development of economic recovery plan. The other item to keep in mind is that in the development of this framework, it is a higher level document. It isn't a comprehensive economic recovery plan. What it does do is it lays out those things that need to be considered in the development of a comprehensive economic recovery plan. Additionally, not only will recovery be noted and accounted for in it, but also resiliency. As recovery is occurring, looking to the future to try to make things more resilient, to be able to reduce impacts from events moving forward, to maybe looking to move things out of the path of danger when possible. All those sorts of things should be looked at and incorporated in this economic recovery plan development. So this framework was put together to help give a little bit of guidance and structure before this economic recovery plan gets underway. Next slide. So this economic recovery plan, there's a couple of key components. To begin with, the plan has information in it, and what it does is it provides goals throughout the document that are broken up as primary, secondary, and support goals. These goals are really put in place within the framework to help understand kind of the time frame that these actions should be taken in. There are those that primary, they really need to be looked at in the shorter term, either because of ease of implementation or because of the seriousness involved with some of these items. Then there are those secondary goals. They're kind of mid-range goals. They can stretch out to about 2 years in time. And then you have kind of longer range support goals that can go on for extended periods of time, years at a time. So in each of these sections that are broken up within the economic recovery plan framework, it starts off, as we've talked about many times already, in regards to consistency across planning documents. So that's going to begin with the county's core planning documents, things such as comprehensive plans, making sure that those sorts of things are reviewed and that there's consistency amongst those, and then making sure that any information from recovery plans, hazard mitigation plans, debris management, those are then incorporated into those core planning documents within a county and communities. The other thing that's going to be very critical is to define what economic recovery is. You know, how involved, how engaged, what is the county's role in economic recovery? How much assistance is provided? And so just making sure that that role is clearly defined, that communities and people in the area and the region understand exactly what the role of the county will be. And part of that's going to be the recommended development of an economic recovery team. That team, again, this framework gives a little bit of guidance and some recommendations as to how to set this up, when transfer of power, how much power should this economic recovery team have at transition from response to recovery. And then at some point, as recovery continues, there may need to be a transition from the economic recovery team to maybe another department or something that can carry on that recovery in a longer term. Sometimes you will have projects that they're often referred to as legacy projects. They may take years at a time, but they have very substantial impacts on the community, especially in regards to resilience and mitigation. You can put these legacy projects into place that can really help prevent and mitigate impacts well into the future. So, but that may require transitions from your immediate economic recovery team to maybe a department or something like that. So additionally, just understanding the roles, making sure that you have staff understanding what your connections are, what your resources are within the area in order to have all of the recovery information available, understanding what your resources are, what your funding resources are going to be, local, state, and federal funding resources, making sure that all that information is collected in the recovery plan. The framework goes through and marks all these items that you should take into account and take into consideration in the development of this more comprehensive economic recovery plan. Then it starts to get into looking at things such as the potential impacts based on specific disasters. So obviously, specific disasters may have extremely varying impacts. And so because of that, you want to take a look at what those may be so that you have a recovery plan in place specific to what the event may be. That's going to involve looking at what the economic assets are within the community, seeing their potential exposure to risk. Are they adaptable? Can they adapt as a disaster occurs and recovery starts to take place? How easily can they rebound? So taking a lot of these things into consideration is going to be critical in development of that plan so that you can have the most effective and efficient recovery possible. When it comes to economic recovery, time really is critical. Businesses cannot last very long if they don't have the support they need. Fundamental things such as water and power, being able to have access to businesses, whether that be access, digital access, because many businesses are now conducting business over the internet, or actual physical access, having that debris management so that the roads are cleared and people can get to where they need to go to buy goods, and workers can get there as well. And so as these are identified, it then leads into eventually what the recovery activities can be. Knowing what these impacts may be, where these vulnerabilities lie, what recovery activities can then be put into place, and having that planned out so that when a disaster hits, everyone is on the same page. You know exactly what the plan is, what the recovery activities are, and those can be engaged as quickly as possible. So again, the framework kind of lays this all out and gives some guidance and some considerations for the development of the more comprehensive economic recovery plan over time. So go ahead to the next slide. And so, as was mentioned earlier, the economic recovery framework has these kind of two categories for recovery. When it comes to recovery, the first thing you want to look at is the continuum time frame. It was mentioned earlier. And so what recovery activities are necessary or can take place in that short term, that more intermediate, and then those longer term. And what was done in the framework was there was kind of these broader economic recovery categories. All of the specific items under utilities or accessibility were not identified, but that would take place as part of the comprehensive economic recovery plan development. So you have these general recovery categories, and then which ones need to have specific activities assigned to them in the short term and intermediate. When it comes to economic recovery, again, short term and intermediate. The short term, within days, businesses really need to have their power up and running, broadband. There has to be accessibility. They're just very high priority. You have to have your labor force being able to get there. But then as time goes on, some of those items start to shift. What those recovery categories are. Some of that is because businesses cannot be out of business for extended periods of time. So if utilities are not restored within a certain time period and businesses can't get up and running, then you lose that opportunity and businesses are put at risk. So some of these are just because out of necessity they need to be there, and you can see some of them indicated here. And then other ones such as facility improvements. Similarly, that has to take place if a business requires a facility to work out of, that has to be provided. And then you're not looking to that as much in the long term, because if it wasn't provided earlier on, chances are the business which required that facility was not able to sustain being closed for that long. And so it no longer is a long-term goal because the businesses just couldn't survive over that much time. However, once you start looking into the longer term, you're starting to look at things like financial recovery. Sometimes businesses had to incur debt in order to make it through a disaster. So you start to look at, are there financial resources available? Is there funding available through state and federal programs? And similarly, you start to really focus on the mitigation aspect. In some cases, you may have folks displaced for extended periods of time. And while you can get some customers and some labor force back, it may take sometimes years to recover and get your full customer base and labor force back. So again, these are kind of broken up into these general categories, but they'll be broken out into much more detail in the final economic recovery plan. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Scott.
Thanks, Erik. Appreciate it. So I'm going to cover this last piece, this last component we have, and then get to your questions. We talked a little bit about, we developed continuity of operations tools and trainings. And this is something I saw some questions about this, which I'm glad to highlight and actually provide an answer and hopefully a solution for some of those questions. This term is one, we scoped this, of course, as Cynthia indicated, several years ago, this project. We wanted to get all of us better acquainted with continuity of operations because we understood from our research this it was a smart thing to do, to dedicate time to, and to have resources to help us get further down the line. Now, of course, the last couple of years, with the impact of COVID, a lot of us learned some components of this term, whether you knew it or not. So basically, it's what you can do, how you can plan in advance to make sure that your key functions of your organization, whatever it is, can be carried out after an emergency. We certainly all experience that in different ways, depending on your workplace. And of course, we all deal with that differently. So part of this project looked to provide resources for starting with local governments, because we thought that we heard from local governments this was something that was important to further fine tune and advance. I'll say that's something too in county government we want to do as well. And businesses as well. This is an important point because businesses, of the several businesses and business owners I talked to over the course of this project, it's a different resource for those folks, and it's a different challenge. And I appreciate that. And also I appreciate the time of business owners and how difficult that is to make time for this. So we want to basically minimize those disruptions to, both residents and customers, get people back up and running. So there's some tools and suggestions for how to do that. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute to get back to normal. Next slide, please. As part of the business, the importance of this is you've probably heard and seen even the impacts of natural hazards on businesses. This is some research that's both FEMA and the Institute of Business and Home Safety pulled out to show that, of those businesses that close due to a hazard event, at least, 25% of those businesses closed won't reopen. Furthermore, you see this kind of third category here as well. It's such a fact that if you don't have a plan in place for how you're going to rebound too, a pretty high percentage of businesses too after disasters, even a couple of years after, this statistic says 75% without a plan may fail. So this is something that we felt strong about to get some resources and advance this discussion with the community. Next slide, give you a little bit of summary of this. We did 2 different trainings, which actually on our website, which I'll tell you about in just a second, gives you some sense of, we have those archived trainings for you to take a look at with YouTube recordings, but also some key resources in terms of actual plans you can utilize to help advance whatever your business may be. But also local government too, some key different things that local governments can do differently. Go ahead to the next slide, please. I'll give you a couple take homes from this. So in this resource, and again, I really encourage you to take a look at this aspect of our on our website, which I'll point out in a second. It shows and reemphasize the importance of having at least thought through this and documented some aspects of continuity, thinking about how you will rebound, and also key components for staffing and how you support staff. Again, no matter what your business may be, helping to get people up to speed with these terms, and thinking about the individuals that you work for and with, thinking through how you can support them doing their work if they needed to go quickly, go kits, things for mobilization, or thinking about if you don't physically have an office, what does that look like, and how are you at risk, and how do you store things, or if you have things in the office, how is that stored? Thinking about, could you do your work in a different location, details of that. There's a whole kind of list of items you can think through about that, and also thinking through other kind of nuts and bolts for how you need to think about agreements you might have to have in place to kind of prepare for that situation. So I really encourage you to take a look at those resources and look at those trainings on our website that give you a little better insight of key things to be thinking about. Go ahead, the next slide. So again, marching toward your questions here, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about next steps. As Cynthia alluded to in the timeline, we're trucking toward wrapping this project up in the next couple of months. Again, the Department of State contract and our contract with Tech Trek will be sunsetting this summer. And what we're doing is we realize there's a lot to these, a lot of details with these different plan components that we outlined. And it's a lot to take in. And, quite frankly, I'll admit too, it's overwhelming. So one of the things we thought from the front end, like, how are we going to combine all these pieces together? Well, we're trying to do that through an online interactive story map that we're undertaking to knit those key pieces together. So there's really a couple of reasons why we do that. One, we're looking to do that to help people get into the information and look at the key components of that information in an easier way. So as Cynthia alluded to earlier, interactive maps, other components tying back to those key hazards we're concerned about, but allow you to get more information if you're really into that particular topic, but get the key information as well. And as the other presenters noted as well, kind of showing the relationship between those various pieces and thinking through collectively, hey, what are those key things that we can do in the next 5 years, in the next decade, to really advance, to build our resilience and our ability to recover. So that's what we're working on here as a part of that. And part of the kind of outreach we want to have with all of you, we know we all are stronger on this work when we work together and kind of grow the tent, if you will, in terms of building resiliency. We know we need specialists from all different ends of things to help advance this in a meaningful way. This is not just a government-driven and motivated piece. We need everybody to do that. And I think that part of the strength is learning from the different kind of specialties and different perspectives in our community to think through how we can build that. So part of the intent on this too is to build this in a way that's easier to digest and help us see our progress too in terms of implementing this moving forward, so we can really feel like we're in a good spot should we need this information in a hazard disruption period of time. So go ahead to the next slide, and I think we'll get into some of our questions here.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Cynthia and Erik and Lisa and everyone who has been listening in and sending in some really thoughtful questions. So the first, I'm going to take two together, and Scott, I'm going to send it to you and maybe you'll direct as needed. The first sort of overarching question is, how can community members, municipalities positively adjust recognized flood levels to current or recent events as they're known? Is this a FEMA, town, county, or state task? And then there was a related question: if a town receives a CRS rating of 8 or 9, could the residents receive above 5% in insurance premium deduction, or it's probably reduction?
Let's see, maybe I'll start with that first one and then see if Cynthia has some insights on the CRS question. Well, taking into account, I guess, other information that communities have in terms of maybe, I think I'm hearing that and understanding that is higher risk than maybe that we currently understand or know. I think that's certainly something that it starts local, I believe. I think if you have information or something that gives you a sense that you have a higher risk than is known through current FEMA resources, I think that's something that you as a community can advocate that you take that into account and maybe update that as a part of your local regulations to make sure you're responding and aware of that, and also educate people about that in terms of higher risk, if I'm understanding that correctly. I also understand that, as a part of our FEMA flood map updates, there are questions about local information and how that fits with those map updates. So one of the pieces and times to share that is going to be the fall this year. I talked to a FEMA representative yesterday that talked about that process. There'll be a public meeting about those map updates in the fall and those draft maps. So that's the time to share and recalibrate some of those details as well. But certainly, I think local information is very valuable, and sharing that and making the folks most immediate to you aware of that, I think is the first step. CRS questions. Cynthia, do you have any other insights on that one?
Sure, and I'll just take one other comment on the flood maps. I'm interpreting that question to perhaps be asking, can we tell what the return period or the probability of a recent flood event is? And the answer to that is there are tools to do that. So each NFIP community has a flood insurance study, or an FIS, and in that there's a flood profile. It's a graph, and you can plot at a specific location the height of the flood, so you can understand what that return period is. Now, having said that, your flood maps are very dated. As Scott said, you're getting new ones. So when you have your new flood insurance study, it should be very accurate for you to understand what the return period of a flood is at your location. And there are a lot of tools online, and I know the county's got some maps up there already. There's maps in the hazard mitigation plan. So those are all tools you can use to understand the magnitude of a potential flood at your property. Okay, and in the hazard mitigation plan, there is information related to the types of damages that would be seen at a particular facility for instance, a 1% flood event. So the information's there. I hope that helped with that. Now, on the community rating system, I'm glad you asked that question. So the community rating system is a challenging program, but it does provide a great benefit for property owners that are insured by the NFIP, right, in a community that participates in the CRS. So it is a reverse scale. It's almost like a golf score. If you are a class 9, you get 5% discount on your insurance. If a community is a class 8, you get 10%. So I believe the question was, well, if you're in a community that gets an 8 or 9, can you get more discount? Well, if your community works hard to get a better rating, the community rating system, then you get a better discount. However, I want to also add some information that Risk Ranking 2.0 has been released. And that is now affecting how insurance rates are, properties are being rated, and how premiums are being adjusted. So all the information we did about the CRS, is current. However, it could be changing very soon. But it still remains that participating in the CRS should be reducing the flood insurance premiums in a community that's participating. So hope that helped.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Scott. Now we have a question that's kind of looking at the challenges from a different perspective and quite long term. And I'm going to read the question, and I think I'll let our panelists decide who should answer it. The question is, the only electrical power we produce locally is from solar, and this source should increase slowly. Is solar generated power included in this plan, or should it be?
It's a good question. This, perhaps in the way that the questioner is asking, I don't think it's comprehensively addressed. I think it's a very intriguing question in terms of the role that solar plays on resilience, and I absolutely believe that's the case. It very much connects, and I do think that there's a lot of this discussion that connects between our resiliency and advancing environmental quality as well, especially solar developed in the right way. I will say that we have had discussions, and there are actually actions, a part of our hazard mitigation plan that looks at building resilience through creative solar and other kind of electrification efforts. So for instance, building the advancement of battery initiatives connected with some battery and solar connected initiatives that fulfill some of the generator needs that we used to think of as straight diesel concerns. This has been a growing national conversation too. So I do think solar plays a role in how we build resilience. I think that's a way in terms of, we're working at the county to electrify our fleet. We're thinking about that in terms of building resilience in there, in terms of perhaps solar supported EV connections. I don't think the question that you're talking about, which is a good one, that I think we should explore maybe further, is the role moving forward for our community power for electrifying through solar is not directly addressed, but it's a really intriguing one to think through as we move forward.
All right. Thank you. Now, our next question has to do with funding. And again, Scott, I'll raise the question and let you direct it to any of our panelists as you think is appropriate. The question is that we know as the climate crisis worsens, disasters will become more frequent. As we do these assessments, are we thinking of the larger state, regional, and national picture? How many billions of dollars from the government are available to address these multiple quote unquote recovery efforts?
Well, it's less and less, right? I think, and I'd be interested to hear any of the folks from Tetra to think about this too, but I'll tell you right now, I am absolutely support efficiencies in government use of public funds. And I think part of the intriguing thing with a lot of these efforts that put an emphasis on the front end of things, we know very well the way that we have to, get a lot of money in terms of the response. FEMA realizes that's really an unsustainable way to keep feeding just in terms of helping with response in communities post-disaster. And so they're incentivizing, partly realizing that the return on the investments in the front end on things that mitigate risk and also plan for that are actually really good investments. I mean, I think the return on investments like a 4-to-1 or something in that range. So I do know that it's not a completely sustainable option to think through. We're going to continue to have funding to deal with this issue, but when we think about, I think, climate change and adaptation, it really is a critical economic issue too, in terms of how we think about how we sustain ourselves moving forward. That's something that has been really clear in this process too, in speaking with the local highway superintendents and somehow how their budgets have been adversely impacted by these significant, smaller scale but intensive hazard events. That's real. I mean, that's real year to year, and thinking through how we can reduce that back end spending is really critical. So I think the answer is basically, we're not going to continue to have money for all of us in all the communities throughout our country to be able to respond, which is why we're trying to put emphasis on this. And I think why agencies too incentivize planning efforts such as this, like the Department of State, realizes, hey, we're going to hopefully get some more information here about how we, not only in Tompkins County, can provide some insights to our county, but we share this with across the state too, of things that we can hopefully make our state more resilient too. Any other thoughts from the Tech Trek folks on that?
Sure, I'll jump in there. I did just want to remind everyone that, again, with FEMA, there's been a lot of money that's been made available as a result of the disasters that we've had in the past years. And the FEMA program is very focused on not only mitigation, but resiliency. So I think all communities should keep in mind that there is a funding stream. And as Scott knows, we don't know what the future will bring, but I can tell you what's happening right now. In 2020, the FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program had $450 million available for mitigation and resilience projects. So we're talking of projects that could reduce localized and stormwater flooding. They could be, urban stormwater parks, or they could be stream management. But the key is they have to mitigate or lessen the risk of flooding. They could also, this funding also was able to be used to buy generators to create, continuous power, microgrids. So somebody said solar, that a solar microgrid is definitely something that it could be part of a mitigation and resilience project. So in 2020, just through BRIC, there was $450 million. However, in 2021, this past year, that went up to $3 billion. So, that money is nationally competitive. It's not easy to get to, but if you have a strong project, you have to demonstrate things that, such as it's benefiting socially vulnerable populations. If you have any, natural and beneficial functions or environmental benefits as part of your project, that helps too. So there are a lot of, hurdles to go over, but the money is there. So then we have, just in New York State, there are two statewide hazard mitigation grant programs, which I know some of the communities in Tompkins County have been, vying for. The first one was from the Presidential Disaster 4480, and that was $300 million was available. And then from Disaster 4615, there was 40 million. So $340 million is available just for communities in New York State. And a lot of communities have been applying for those. And, I know, from working on the project with communities, that some Tompkins County communities have done that. So that's the kind of money that's available. And then the last thing, which is very nebulous, is the infrastructure bill. We're looking at literally billions of dollars from the infrastructure bill that is trickling down. And, that's a bigger question than I can answer. But that money and infrastructure, that is to support resilience. So
thank you,
my 2
Cynthia.
cents.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. So we've dealt with questions at very high levels and looking into the future and strategic. Now we have a question that's, I think, more immediate and very practical. And I think maybe it might be a topic that Erik or Lisa might be able to weigh in on. And the question is very simple. Will the food supply and distribution be part of the final plan?
I'll go ahead and take that. Yes, absolutely. So that's actually one of the items that is called out in the framework. Food, the availability of food. And again, that's why I had mentioned things such as accessibility. The accessibility, as important as it is for economic recovery, is important for all recovery. That accessibility, making sure that the food, one, that there's adequate food supply, two, that the food can get to where it needs to go. So just as the laborers, workers, consumers need to be able to get there, so do all of the emergency service people, social service individuals, food, water, all those things. So yes, accessibility, making sure all those connections are being looked at. And that often means that you have to look well beyond your own geography into areas that you may not have as much control over. And that's where it starts to become difficult, and where you sometimes have to reach out to neighboring communities, neighboring counties, regional organizations, state departments, because we don't live, and everything does not occur in a bubble. A lot of that stuff is coming in from other areas. So it is critical that when you're looking at access to the county, what are those other areas that may be impacted? While there's not a whole lot you can do about it necessarily, being able to find out maybe what your neighboring counties may be doing about it. Are there things that you can do to support? So yeah, the connectivity is key. In regards to food and food supply. That's a little bit more difficult because I mean, we're very lucky in that in this country, we usually have a fairly decent access to food. So having very long extended periods without food access is usually not as much of an issue, but certainly in the short term, being able to make sure that there is going to be food immediately after a disaster and in those days and weeks after that, that's critical. And FEMA and a lot of other emergency responders often have systems in place and plans for that, but it is definitely something that would be taken into account. So, sorry, longer answer than probably.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Erik. Now,
I'll just add one piece on that
Okay.
too, is my Erik and Lisa did a good description of how response weighs into recovery here too. And I know my colleagues at the Department of Emergency Response are working on updating their emergency management plan in that response, that those types of things that you just talked about too, I'm sure will be tackled as part of that update.
thank you, Scott, and thank you, Erik. So we've talked about policies, we've talked about specific practices. Now we have a question about people. How can we make sure we have a plan in place to help elderly, people with disabilities, people with health issues, in, you know, our vulnerable, the vulnerable members of our community? How can we make sure that there's a plan and processes in place for them?
I mean, I'll start with this. This is something we take very seriously in thinking about those in our community that may have a more difficult time dealing with particular situations and hazard events. And in particular, when we looked at the hazard mitigation plan through the different hazards, we thought through that, you know, for this particular hazard, who would be more vulnerable than others? And so that kind of raised some questions. And I'll just tell you one example that we're thinking about for one of the components we talked about earlier was the debris management plan. And we realized that, okay, so there's a couple things we need to think about here for how we, you know, should we be in a situation where that needs to be enacted, the debris management plan? How do we communicate that? One, that's something we're going to be working with the good folks on this call and the folks from Diversity and Tetra Tech to help us do things in terms of how we communicate, basically, you know, a playbook for how we can better communicate with people in urban areas and rural areas on different topics. But also for that topic, we do think that, of course, the elderly is going to have a disproportionately difficult time, perhaps, managing large-scale debris and thinking through kind of what tax we need to take for that. Also in that messaging too, we do know that we want to make sure we're adequately communicating to non-native speakers. So we think about that in advance to make sure we're respectfully reaching out to all different folks in our communities so they know kind of what to do and how to process things and where to go for support. So it's something I think we take very seriously and look through from different angles to think through, you know, who's going to perhaps need some added support or a different way of interacting with these different topics.
Thank you, Scott. I think we have time for one more question, and I know we will talk about how the community can get involved and stay involved with the planning, but I think that we can leave them with a few practical suggestions in answering this question. Is what should I do to prepare my home for future hazards? And is there any funding available to pay for it?
Good question, Susan. I'll open with this. I'll tell you right now, if you're interested in this topic, the next week at this time, or on the 25th, so next Wednesday at high noon, Sustainable Tompkins is going to be hosting their Finger Lakes Forecast webinar series. It's going to talk about reducing flood risk for your home. I'll be talking a little bit about flood risk in particular, and my friend from Tompkins Trust, Sally Hoyt, who I believe is on the call here too, talk about insurance. And then there's a guy by the name of Alan Springett, who is a former FEMA mitigation specialist, who's going to talk about specific things you can do for your home. So that's Sustainable Tompkins, Sustainable Finger Lakes. You can go to their site to register for that event next week. Other pieces to bring up? Anyone else from Tetra Tech want to talk about that?
Well, specific to flooding, again, we talked a little bit about, I guess, how to reduce your flood risk through CRS. But communities can advocate for their flood-prone residents and obtain funding to elevate or acquire a flood-prone property. So that's something to keep in mind. Since all the communities in Tompkins County have an approved hazard mitigation plan, they would be able to apply for funding to elevate a home or acquire a home. And I think that's maybe one of the most direct ways, you know, your home could be mitigated.
Thank you, Cynthia. Okay, I'm sorry. There's one question that I want to know the answer to, so I'm going to ask this question. What is freeboard and why would it be required for new homes?
Is that me again?
Go ahead.
I don't even know.
Freeboard is an intriguing term. So freeboard is a term to identify the height your lowest member of your structure is over a regulatory flood elevation. So therefore, if you're in a floodplain and your regulatory flood or 100-year flood, right, is going to be, you know, let's say 2 feet over the ground level, then your home, if it has 2 feet of freeboard, would have to be built to be 4 feet above ground level. So freeboard is a safety factor when you build a home to avoid getting flooded. I think that's the simplest way to put it.
Thank you, Cynthia. And that does
Sure.
seem like a good way to wrap up our discussion here. And let's go on to the next slide and leave our community members here with ways that you can stay engaged with the plan. And before we start, again, on behalf of all of us on the project team, thank you to all of you for joining us and sharing your questions and thoughts and being involved. And I know you join me in thanking Scott and Erik and Lisa, and of course, Cynthia, for all of this very careful, detailed, rigorous planning. So thank you. So community members, this is where you get to step up and get involved. You can review the plan documents on the website. The URL is here. I will read it for those who might be listening in on phones. It's www.tompkinscounty.ny.gov/planning/climate-adaptation. There are no spaces anywhere. Second place or pathway to get involved is share your thoughts. Have we missed anything? We've covered a lot of territory, topics, and aspects here today, but it's possible there's other stuff as we even heard that people are thinking in different ways. Share your thoughts by email at planning@tompkins-co.org or by phone at 607-274-5560. And of course, please share this presentation. A recording will be available on the website, and we encourage you to share it with others who couldn't join us today. So thank you to Tompkins County, and we wish everyone a safe and enjoyable summer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.